January 17, 1944. The biting cold of winter has just begun to retreat, leaving the sprawling Texas landscape beneath a wide, cloudless sky. A transport train rumbles across the dusty plains, its wheels screeching against the iron rails, signaling the arrival of the women it carries. In the distance, the faint sound of hooves can be heard growing louder, the rhythmic clip-clop echoing through the air. The harsh steel of the train's metal wheels contrasts sharply with the sound of leather, saddles creaking as cowboys, men dressed in weathered hats and boots, gather in the shadows of the POW camp. As the doors of the train are thrown open, the women emerge, their faces pale and guarded beneath their worn German uniforms. They move cautiously, each step filled with anticipation of the violence and hardship they have come to expect from their captors. Instead of the harsh command of soldiers they were familiar with, the air around them feels different, tense but strangely inviting. They are not greeted with chains but reins. Horses stand nearby, snorting softly, their glossy coats catching the last rays of daylight. The women, bewildered and silent, look around in confusion, unsure if this is some sort of cruel trick. How could these rugged men, the very symbol of an enemy they had been taught to fear, offer such a contrast to the terror they had expected? The smell of leather and hay fills the air. A breeze rustles the dry grass beneath their feet. For the first time in years, the women feel a strange, almost unfamiliar sense of relief. Yet the unease lingers. What would happen next? Shall I continue to the context and background section? The early years of World War II had been brutal for all involved. The conflict had stretched its reach from Europe to Asia, and its consequences were being felt on every continent. By 1944, the war had entered its most intense phase. Nazi Germany, under the iron grip of Adolf Hitler, was facing mounting defeats across multiple fronts. While the Allies pushed into Italy and the Soviet Union closed in from the east, Hitler's Reich had begun to crumble. Germany had been at war since 1939, and its forces had quickly overrun much of Europe. Yet, as the war dragged on, the resources of the Reich dwindled and its grasp on power weakened. In the east, the Germans were forced to retreat, while in the west, the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, heralded the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. Meanwhile, the United States, having entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, had begun to flex its military might. American forces were stationed across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The American military had been transformed since the early days of the war, bolstered by its industrial capacity and massive influx of personnel. Despite the gravity of the war's progress, there was an aspect of this great conflict that the women of Germany had never anticipated: the role of prisoners of war, especially female POWs. While most of the focus had been on the treatment of male soldiers, less attention had been given to the women who had been caught in the web of war. Women in Germany had been active in various roles during the conflict, from the workforce in war industries to serving as auxiliaries in the military. The women who were captured and taken as prisoners were often part of the last stages of the war, when German forces were retreating on multiple fronts, especially in France and Italy. Many had been soldiers in the German auxiliary forces, or had been involved in war-related work. By the time they were captured, the brutality of the Nazi regime was no longer just a distant fear. It was a lived reality. The American military, while committed to defeating the enemy, held a different set of values, particularly when it came to the treatment of prisoners. There was no overarching plan to publicly humiliate or terrorize female POWs, in the way the Germans had with their captives. Instead, American officers in Texas, where many of the prisoners were sent, chose to uphold a somewhat unusual level of humanity in their dealings with these women. The Texas POW camps, primarily designed to hold German soldiers, were far from the grim, harsh prisons of war expected in Europe. The vastness of the state, with its open skies and miles of ranch land, offered a strange contrast to the confined, militarized world the POWs had known in Europe. The women were housed in these camps, often under the supervision of soldiers who were more familiar with cattle ranching and horse riding than the fierce and bloodied brutality of war. This contrast, though, was not only physical, it was cultural. The Germans, in particular, were conditioned to expect cruelty from their captors, especially the Americans, whom they saw as the antithesis of everything German military culture represented. But in the wide expanse of Texas, they would soon encounter a radically different treatment. The horses, used by American soldiers for everything from transport to recreation, would become the first and most striking symbol of that difference. For these German women, used to a war-torn, regimented existence, a horse wasn't just an animal. It was a symbol of freedom. The idea that they would be entrusted with the reins, rather than chained or humiliated in a traditional manner, stood in sharp contrast to their expectations. The choice of Texas for these camps was not accidental. The American military had established several internment camps throughout the United States for enemy prisoners, with Texas being one of the largest holding areas. The women who found themselves there in 1944 had traveled thousands of miles from Europe, having been captured on the battlefields of Italy and France. They had been transported across the ocean on cargo ships, facing conditions far more severe than anything they would experience in the relative comfort of a Texas POW camp. In a strange twist of fate, these women would find themselves at the mercy of not just the soldiers, but of a larger American mythology, the cowboy, the horse, and the ideals that came with them. They would soon learn that the world of the American soldier was not as cruel or as unfeeling as the world they had known. In fact, the men who took them in, cowboys, ranchers, and soldiers alike, would treat them in a way that was both perplexing and, to many of them, unsettling. In the spring of 1944, the German women POWs began arriving in the Texas camps, transported from the battlefields of Europe. Most of them had been captured after the German retreat from Italy and France. As these women stepped off the trains and into the dusty open-air camps, they were immediately struck by the difference in the environment. Gone were the cold, cramped, and oppressive prisons of the Eastern Front, where they had feared death or torture on a daily basis. Instead, they found themselves in a vast, sun-drenched landscape, where the only immediate threat was the foreignness of it all. Texas was, to many of these women, a land of myth. The idea of America as a land of abundance, of prosperity and freedom, had been distorted by Nazi propaganda. They had been taught to fear the Americans, to see them as invaders who would stop at nothing to destroy their homeland. The very idea that these soldiers would treat them with respect was incomprehensible. As the women began to adjust to their new surroundings, their first surprise came in the form of the horses. The American officers, many of them former cowboys or ranchers, had seen horses as an essential part of their daily lives. But for the German POWs, horses represented a completely different set of associations. Horses were not just animals, they were tools of military control. Yet in this Texas camp, the women were not commanded to march, nor were they thrown into a cage like animals themselves. Instead, they were given the reins. What these women didn't understand at first was that this act, the simple act of placing them on horses, was an expression of the very things they had been raised to despise about America. It was a direct challenge to the image of the brute American soldier they had been taught to fear. The act itself was almost alien. Instead of chains, there were reins. Instead of brutality, there was a sort of calm, surprising humanity. The American cowboy ethos had no parallel in the Nazi regime. To be given the reins of a horse was not a punishment. It was a privilege, one that symbolized freedom in a way the women had never considered. This treatment was also strategically important. While these German women were captured soldiers, their captivity was not a part of the brutal totalitarian system that had imprisoned millions of civilians across Europe. They were held as prisoners of war, and thus were treated according to the rules of the Geneva Conventions, which dictated that POWs should be treated with dignity and respect. Though some might argue that the camps in Texas were still part of the machinery of war, there was no denying the unusual, even disorienting, humanity extended to these women. For the officers overseeing the camps, this represented a conscious decision. The men who ran the camps in Texas, many of them veterans of the Great Depression or the American frontier, had a different perspective on authority. Their sense of duty was shaped by an understanding that even in the darkest times of war, certain codes of behavior could not be abandoned. It was not uncommon for American soldiers to show kindness to POWs, offering them food, basic comforts, and even the opportunity to take part in light activities like horseback riding. This form of soft power had an intended psychological effect. The German military had used propaganda throughout the war to portray the Americans as violent, uncivilized, and driven by a desire for domination. The experience of these POWs, however, would challenge those notions. They were not treated as criminals, nor were they forced to perform menial labor under harsh conditions. Instead, they were taken under the supervision of men who offered a strange new form of respect, and even empathy. For the POWs, this treatment was bewildering. The German women had been indoctrinated in the idea of a ruthless and unforgiving enemy, but the American soldiers who greeted them in Texas seemed to defy every expectation. The thought that they were not being led to a brutal death or further hardship left them in a state of constant confusion. Were the Americans weak? Were they being lured into a false sense of security before facing even worse consequences? There was no shortage of questions, but no easy answers either. Despite their uncertainty, the women soon found themselves facing a new reality. The Texas landscape, so foreign to them, became a symbol of something else entirely. Here they were allowed to experience a brief moment of peace, of control over their own movement, something they had not known in years. As they climbed onto the horses, the unfamiliar motion of the animals beneath them became a silent metaphor for the unexpected journey they were now on. They were still prisoners, yes, but they were no longer bound by chains. They could feel the wind, the freedom of movement, the very pulse of a land they had been taught to hate. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of what to do with these creatures of leather and muscle that were as foreign to them as the land they now found themselves in. Yet, as they spent more time with the horses, a strange transformation began to take place. Riding was not just an escape from the rigid confines of captivity. It was an encounter with a freedom they had never before considered. The presence of the horse became a symbol for what was so starkly different between Germany and the United States. Where the Nazi regime had relied on oppression, cruelty, and control, the Americans used a different approach. It was not the strength of domination that the women encountered in Texas. It was a different kind of strength, one based on individual freedom, the ability to move and think beyond the bounds of rigid command. The women who found themselves in the Texas POW camps had, by 1944, been through years of war. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but rather women caught in the periphery of a global conflict. Many had been forced into service during the war's later years, either as auxiliary workers or members of the German Women's Armed Services. For them, the war had long since ceased to be a matter of ideology. It was simply survival. For these women, captivity meant fear and uncertainty. They had grown accustomed to the iron discipline of the Third Reich, a regime that viewed human lives as expendable. The women had been subjected to a constant state of repression, where dissent was crushed and loyalty was demanded. Many had already been exposed to the cruelty of the war, having lost loved ones or seen cities bombed to rubble. Now, as prisoners, they faced the possibility of even worse, especially at the hands of their captors. But Texas was different. The women did not arrive to the brutality they had expected. Instead, they found themselves in a land of open skies and shockingly kindness. At first, it was too much to believe. The officers, many of whom were farmers or cowboys, did not treat them as enemies but as people, a concept that had been foreign to these women under the harshness of Nazi ideology. The sight of horses in the distance, and the notion that they would be placed on them, instead of confined or punished, seemed too absurd to be real. The first time one of the women mounted a horse, there was an awkwardness to it, both physical and psychological. The horse, a creature that had no place in the wartime narrative of cruelty and militarism, felt foreign beneath them. The women had been taught that they were instruments of war, that they existed only in relation to their duties and the state. And yet here in the open Texas fields, they felt a strange and disorienting sense of agency. The freedom of being able to move, to control their own bodies in a way they hadn't for years. It was a fleeting sensation, but for some of the women it was transformative. It reminded them of their own humanity, something they had almost forgotten under the brutality of their captivity and the war that had consumed their lives. While horses themselves were not a new technology, their use in warfare had taken on a significant, almost symbolic role during World War II. Horses were still a common means of transport and work for both Axis and Allied powers in many regions of the world. especially in areas where mechanized vehicles had yet to reach or could not operate. The use of horses on the front lines was widespread in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where cavalry units were still engaged in battle, and in the German Wehrmacht, where they provided essential logistical support in the absence of trucks or tanks. In the American Southwest, however, horses had a much different cultural connotation. The cowboy tradition, rooted in the ranching culture of the region, imbued the animal with a sense of freedom and individualism. To the American soldiers, horses were not just beasts of burden, they were a connection to the past, to the history of the American frontier, and to the pioneering spirit that had built the nation. The presence of horses in the camps provided a unique connection between the American identity and the German POWs' perception of their captors. For the women who had been trained to view the Americans as backward and barbaric, the sight of soldiers on horseback challenged that notion. Horses represented not just rural Americana, but the flexibility and mobility that defined the Allied forces' approach to warfare. They could be used in combat, in transport, and as a symbol of the broader American ethos that stood in stark contrast to the mechanized, factory-driven war effort of Nazi Germany. For the women who had been taken prisoner, the act of riding the horses became something more than just a chance to move. It was a moment of redefinition, of reconciling the technology of war with the unexpected humanity of their captors. The horses became not only tools of survival, but also symbols of the psychological power of the American system, where individuals, both captors and captives, could still engage in moments of shared humanity amidst the machinery of war. The decision to treat the German women POWs with a level of dignity and respect that they hadn't anticipated can be attributed to the unique blend of leadership styles among the American officers overseeing the camps. These leaders were not typical military commanders, steeped in strict adherence to military protocol. Many of them were veterans of a different kind of American life. Cowboys, ranchers, and farmers who had been accustomed to a more humane, individualized way of life. For these men, the treatment of POWs was not simply a military or tactical decision. It was a reflection of their broader values. While they had been called to fight in a brutal totalitarian war, they had not forgotten the basic principles of decency and humanity that had shaped their identities back home. They understood the difference between necessary military discipline and the kind of brutality that had marked the war in Europe, particularly under the Nazis. At the heart of this leadership was the cowboy ethos. The idea of fair treatment, respect for life, and a certain rugged individualism permeated the camp. These officers were no strangers to the hardships of the Depression or the challenges of working the land in the unforgiving Texas heat. They recognized that the women in their custody were human beings, not faceless enemies, and they were determined to show them a side of America that was as far removed from the horrors of war as possible. This approach was not without its critics. Some higher-ranking officers believed that treating the German POWs with such unexpected kindness might undermine the morale of the American forces or even send the wrong message to the world. However, the leaders in Texas, most of whom had little interest in political propaganda, continued to place their faith in humanity. To them, showing the women respect was an extension of their personal belief in the power of redemption and reconciliation. The American officers' decision to put the German women on horses instead of chaining them was a powerful reflection of this leadership. It was an assertion that in the face of war there could still be humanity. It was not just an act of kindness, but a challenge to the dehumanizing cruelty that defined much of the Nazi war machine. These officers didn't see their captives as subhuman or as mere trophies of war. They saw them as individuals, capable of growth and change, just as the American soldiers themselves were capable of it. For the German women who had been captured and sent to Texas, their expectations of what captivity would entail were shaped by the brutal stories they had heard from the front lines. They had witnessed the harsh treatment of prisoners in Nazi-occupied territories, and had been subjected to the fear of death or punishment at the hands of enemy soldiers. They were well aware of the atrocities committed by both sides in the war, but they had been led to believe that the Americans, much like the Soviets, would treat them as expendable pawns in a larger conflict. When the women first arrived in Texas, their initial response was one of skepticism and confusion. The American officers, though far from the SS guards they had feared, seemed out of place to the German women. They had been taught to see these men as primitive, uncivilized, and driven by an unrelenting desire for victory at any cost. Yet, as they were herded into the camp, they began to witness something that did not align with their preconceived notions. The sight of American soldiers in cowboy hats, offering them reins and nut chains, was disorienting. The women had expected to be subjected to the same sort of cruel treatment they had witnessed in German POW camps, forced to work under harsh conditions, deprived of dignity, and punished for their mere existence. But instead they were treated with a surprising gentleness that defied their understanding of the enemy. For the German women, this experience was a moment of cognitive dissonance. They had been conditioned to believe that the Americans were the ultimate enemy, the very embodiment of everything their leaders had warned them about. Yet, as they were placed on horseback and shown around the camp, they began to question these assumptions. It was not just the physical freedom that struck them. It was the emotional impact of being treated as something other than mere captives. For some, this was an emotional turning point, an unspoken realization that not all enemies were the same, and not all captors were cruel. This realization, though subtle, was profound. In the context of a war where ideology had dehumanized everyone, where every act of kindness could be seen as an act of betrayal, the treatment of the German women by the Americans was a stark reminder that war could break men and women, but it could also challenge the very ideologies that had driven them to fight. The question of morality in war is one that has plagued historians and philosophers for centuries. Was it right for the American military to treat its German prisoners, especially female POWs, with such care? Or was this an indulgence that undermined the harsh reality of the war? After all, these women were part of the Nazi war machine, a regime that had committed atrocities on an unimaginable scale. From the American perspective, the decision to treat prisoners humanely was not just a moral gesture. It was a statement about the ideals they were fighting for. The United States had entered the war under the banner of democracy, freedom, and justice. While these ideals may have been imperfectly realized back home, the treatment of POWs in camps like the one in Texas reflected the belief that the ideals of liberty and respect for human dignity should be upheld, even in the darkest days of war. However, from the German perspective, the kindness shown to these POWs could be seen as an anomaly, an almost naive approach to warfare. These women had been raised to believe in the supremacy of their state, and the very idea that they were not being punished for their role in the war felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught. For them, it was not just a question of survival, it was a question of loyalty to the Reich, and that loyalty could not be easily shaken, even by kindness. But the moral question of how to treat prisoners of war is not easily answered. By choosing to show respect to these German women, the American officers in Texas made a statement about the potential for redemption in a world torn apart by violence. It was a moral decision to treat prisoners as people, rather than as symbols of an enemy to be crushed. And for the German women, it became a question of whether they could reconcile the kindness they had received with the ideology they had been taught to believe. The decisive moment arrived on a clear, dry afternoon in early spring, as the American camp commander gave the signal for the German women POWs to mount the horses. The stillness of the Texas plains was broken only by the wind and the distant sound of horses' hooves as they snorted in anticipation. The women had spent days adjusting to the disorienting realities of the camp, the wide open space, the kindness of their captors, and the subtle, ever-present tension between disbelief and cautious relief. But now, as they stood in front of the horses, their emotions swung between uncertainty and curiosity. The sight of the horses, sturdy and calm, was initially unsettling. Horses had never been a part of the women's world in the context of war. They had been trained to use military vehicles and weapons, not animals that represented something far older, more organic. For many of these women, horses were anathema to the modern mechanized world of the Wehrmacht. Horses belonged to the rural, peaceful landscapes of civilian life, far from the industrialized warfare they knew. But in Texas, they were confronted with a choice: embrace this foreign moment of control, or reject it as some sort of trick. For the first time since their capture, the women were allowed to experience a moment of physical autonomy. When the officers handed them the reins, The power of movement and decision, however small, was granted to them. Some women hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Others looked at the American officers, still wary, as if searching for any sign that this could be a trap. But soon, the shock of the situation began to sink in. The horses were not tools of oppression, as the women had feared. They were vehicles of mobility, of movement, of travel. They represented a freedom that these women had lost long ago. The first few attempts at riding were awkward, hesitant, the women struggling with unfamiliar saddles and reins. But the American officers, patient and encouraging, helped guide them. It was in these quiet, unexpected moments that the German women began to see the profound difference between their American captors and the brutal regime they had been part of. The turning point came when one of the women, initially apprehensive, broke from the rest of the group and began to ride with more confidence. As she moved farther from the camp, the sense of release was palpable. The woman, who had lived under the constant threat of violence and control, suddenly felt the wind in her hair, the reins firm in her hands, and the sense that she was, for a brief moment, not a prisoner but a person once more. This moment, however fleeting, was a sharp break from the oppressive past. For the women who had endured the horrors of war, the psychological impact of riding horses in the open air of Texas was not simply physical, it was deeply emotional. The terror of captivity was momentarily subdued by the simple act of riding. The horse beneath them, once a symbol of something foreign and intimidating, became an unexpected symbol of freedom, a symbol that they had not seen since before the war began. The sound of hooves against the dry ground was no longer a distant echo of warfare, but the sound of a new kind of liberation. The officers, seeing the transformation in their prisoners, exchanged quiet nods. This was not just a tactical decision to placate or entertain the POWs. It was a recognition that in this small act, they had created something more significant. They had provided these women with a tangible connection to freedom, a stark contrast to the regimented and controlled lives they had known under Nazi rule. In the moments that followed, more women joined in. Slowly but steadily, the camp took on a different air. What had once been a place of fear and confusion was now a camp where, for the first time, the POWs had a measure of control. They were no longer mere captives. They were participants in something beyond the camp's confines. The horses had become not just vehicles for transportation, but tools for psychological liberation. For the women, it was as if the reins in their hands represented something larger than just the power to control an animal. They represented the reins of their own fate, however temporary. This moment of unexpected kindness, so alien to their previous experiences in the war, was a quiet but profound turning point. The fear and suspicion that had clouded their minds began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative understanding that perhaps their captors were not the caricatured villains they had been taught to fear. The shift was subtle at first. But over time, as the days passed and the women rode through the camp on horseback, the psychological effects began to surface. Their perceptions of the American soldiers changed, slowly but surely. These women, who had once viewed the Americans as enemies to be destroyed, now saw them as human beings who offered something unexpected: kindness, empathy, and a chance at personal agency. The transformation in the women was not just physical, it was psychological, deeply personal, and unsettling. The horses had done something to them that they had not anticipated. They had broken the mental chains that had bound them to the ideological and physical world of the Nazis. Riding the horses did not just symbolize freedom. It was a return to a forgotten aspect of humanity, self-determination, however fleeting. For many of these women, this experience was the first tangible manifestation of what it meant to be truly free since the war had begun. Under Nazi rule, they had been expected to conform, to serve the needs of the state without question or deviation. Under American custody, they found a paradox, a system of order, yes, but also one that offered glimpses of something more profound. The opportunity to ride horses was one of those glimpses. The American soldiers, many of whom had been raised on ranches or in farming communities, knew the cultural significance of horses. To them, the horses were not just symbols of rural life or nostalgia. They were a reminder of the fundamental American values of freedom, space, and the open frontier. What seemed like a small act handing reins instead of shackles, became an unmistakable gesture that communicated to these German women that they were more than just prisoners of war. They were individuals capable of choice, even if that choice was just the simple act of moving with dignity. For the German women, the horses symbolized the America they had been taught to fear, but never truly understood. The sight of a cowboy, riding, controlling, and even laughing with the horses, was a world away from the harsh totalitarian structure they had come from. The very notion of a cowboy seemed at odds with the rigid, disciplined world of Nazi Germany. These men were not concerned with rigid militarism. Instead, they lived by the code of self-reliance and personal responsibility. This simple act of offering the reins became a quiet rejection of the cruelty that defined Nazi ideology, and a reflection of what the Allied forces were truly fighting to preserve: the dignity of the individual. As the women began to ride more confidently, their fear slowly gave way to a tentative trust. This was not the kind of treatment they had expected from their enemies. It was not a strategy of humiliation, nor was it an attempt to weaken them by kindness. Instead, it was a recognition of their humanity, something they had long been denied under Nazi rule. The most significant transformation came not through the riding itself, but through what it represented. For the first time, the women were treated not as cogs in the machinery of war, but as people. It was a concept that was so foreign to them that they didn't initially know how to respond. They had been conditioned to believe that their captors, be they Soviet, American, or British, would treat them harshly, just as they had been taught to view those they fought against with contempt. But the reality in the Texas camp was different. The contrast between the kindness of the American soldiers and the cruelty they had expected was profound. As the days passed, the emotional impact of this experience deepened. The women, once wary and distrustful, began to view their captors with a growing sense of curiosity and, in some cases, gratitude. They began to understand that this kindness was not a weakness on the part of the Americans, but a strength, a quiet form of psychological warfare that questioned everything they had been taught. The idea of being civilized in the face of overwhelming brutality was not lost on them. For many of the women, it was a turning point, a realization that the conflict was not just between armies, but between ideologies, between ways of life that were as starkly different as the American West and Nazi Germany. This emotional shift was not immediately evident. Many of the women, especially those with stronger ties to the Nazi ideology, remained cautious and reluctant to fully embrace the kindness they were shown. Yet, for those who allowed themselves to accept it, the experience became a pivotal moment in their personal journey. They had expected to be humiliated, broken, and destroyed by the war. Instead, they were given an unexpected gift, a chance to regain some small measure of control over their lives. It was an act of humanity in the face of war's most inhumane circumstances. The American soldiers, for their part, seemed unaware of the full psychological impact of their actions. They had simply acted out of a belief in their own values, treating the women with the same respect they would offer any human being. To them, this act of kindness was natural. To the women, it was nothing short of revolutionary. It shattered the carefully constructed image of the enemy they had carried with them through the war, replacing it with a far more complex, nuanced understanding. This act of kindness, small though it may seem in the grand scope of the war, was in fact a decisive moment, both for the POWs and for the larger ideological battle of World War II. In this small corner of Texas, on horseback under the vast skies of the American Southwest, the war was being fought on a different kind of terrain. It was no longer just a matter of military strategy, but a battle for the hearts and minds of those who had been consumed by the conflict. The reins that the women held in their hands were more than just a means of controlling the horses. They were a symbol of the power to shape their own futures, a power that had been denied to them by their own country, and now unexpectedly offered by their captors. The consequences of this unexpected treatment were far-reaching, though subtle at first. When the women were repatriated to Germany after the war ended, the memories of their time in Texas stayed with them. In the eyes of their captors, they had been given the reins not just to horses but to their own dignity and humanity. For many of them, the experience in Texas was a brief respite from the horrors of war, a moment when they were not seen as enemies but as human beings. And that fact alone would color their perceptions of the Americans for the rest of their lives. After the war, many of the women returned to their homes in Germany to find a country in ruin. Their towns and cities lay in ruins, their families fractured, and the war had left deep scars in the minds of those who had survived. The emotional toll of being a prisoner of war, compounded by the guilt and shame that many felt for their role in the Nazi regime, was a burden that many struggled with for years. However, their experiences in the American POW camps did not fit neatly into the narrative of victimhood or hatred. They had been prisoners, yes, but they had also been treated with a form of respect that was starkly different from the brutal tactics used by the Nazis. This experience would influence their views on the war, on their captors, and on the larger struggle between ideologies that had defined the conflict. In the years following their return to Germany, some of these women would speak about their time in the American camps with surprising gratitude. They would recount the strange feeling of being placed on horseback, the kindness of their American captors, and the confusing realization that they had been treated not as criminals, but as individuals. It was an experience that challenged the narrative they had been taught about the Allies, that they were simply enemies to be destroyed. Instead, they saw a different side of the American soldiers, one that had been largely hidden from them during the war. For many of the women, this was a moment of cognitive dissonance. They had been raised to believe that the enemy was not just a political adversary, but a symbol of everything they despised. Yet here in Texas, they had seen a different face of the enemy. The men who had captured them were not faceless monsters, but individuals with their own values, their own sense of honor. The experience was jarring, but it opened the door to a new understanding of the war and its complexities. The broader implications of this experience were felt not just by the women, but by the American soldiers who had participated in their care. Many of the officers and soldiers in Texas would return home after the war, carrying with them a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that they had upheld the values they had fought for. They had not just won the war. They had also demonstrated to their captives and to the world that the ideals of freedom and democracy were not just words, but actions. In the larger context of the war, this treatment of POWs served as a reminder that there was another side to the American experience, one that could be defined by compassion and respect, even in the midst of war. While the Allies had fought to defeat the Nazis on the battlefield, they had also fought to preserve the very ideals that made humanity worth defending. In a strange twist of fate, the treatment of these women in Texas embodied the ideals of freedom, dignity, and respect for human life that had been at the heart of the American cause. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. This act of humanity, though not widely known, was part of a broader narrative of the war's human cost. The treatment of POWs in American camps was not just about military strategy or propaganda. It was about maintaining a moral high ground in a world where the lines between right and wrong had been blurred. It was a testament to the strength of the American ideals that, even in the midst of war, they had managed to maintain a sense of compassion and decency toward those who had once been their enemies. For the German women who experienced this unexpected kindness, it was a small but powerful moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. It would shape their understanding of the war, of their role in it, and of the world that lay beyond it. As the years passed and the war's wounds began to heal, the women who had been held in Texas continued to carry with them the imprint of that experience. Some found it difficult to reconcile the kindness they had encountered with the harsh realities of the Nazi regime they had served. The emotional weight of their wartime experiences, combined with the dissonance of how they had been treated by their American captors, became a quiet, lingering reflection for many. The act of receiving humane treatment, being offered the reins to a horse rather than chains, was a stark contrast to everything they had known, and the tension between these two worlds would affect how they rebuilt their lives after returning to post-war Germany. While some of the women spoke openly about their time in the American POW camps, others remained silent, either unwilling or unable to revisit the experience. There was, after all, a deep sense of shame among many former German soldiers and their families who had lived through the destruction wrought by the Nazi regime. The guilt that came from fighting in the war, or worse still, from having supported the regime, was difficult to shed. For these women, the memory of the horses in Texas, of being treated as something other than instruments of war, was not simply a contradiction of their captors' brutality, but a reminder of what had been lost. Yet, despite the emotional complexities, many of the women came to understand that their captors' treatment was not merely the result of American benevolence, but was also a calculated psychological strategy. The kindness they experienced was a weapon of a different sort, one that aimed to break down the walls of Nazi propaganda and ideology. The American treatment of POWs, while humane, was also a form of psychological warfare that sent a clear message to the Germans who had been captured. The war was not just a battle for territory, but for the very heart of human dignity. The way these women were treated, as individuals rather than enemies, was a quiet but potent challenge to the ideology that had led them into battle. For the American soldiers who interacted with the German women, their post-war reflections were equally profound. Most had not entered the war expecting to show kindness to the enemy. Their initial goal was simply to win. But the realization that their actions in Texas had the power to change the hearts and minds of those who had fought against them was a quiet but powerful confirmation of the values they had fought for. They had not only won the war, but had also demonstrated to the women that there was another way, a better way to live. In a war that had torn so many apart, the soldiers in Texas had used the simple gesture of offering reins instead of chains to show that humanity, even in its most brutal moments, had a chance at redemption. In the years that followed, the experiences of the POWs in Texas would remain largely unknown to the wider world. The treatment of German women prisoners of war, particularly in America, was not widely documented, and the details of their experiences were often overshadowed by the larger, more brutal narratives of the war. Yet for the women who had ridden those horses, the memory would endure as a poignant moment of humanity in the midst of one of history's darkest periods. It was a reminder that even in war, when everything seems lost, the possibility for redemption and compassion still exists. As the years turned to decades, the impact of this moment on the women's lives continued to resonate. For some, it was a source of quiet pride. They had seen firsthand that the ideals of freedom, dignity, and respect were not just lofty ideals but were lived out in moments like these, when the simplicity of being placed on a horse offered a fleeting but profound taste of liberty. For others, it remained a painful reminder of how far their world had fallen, and of how the war had shattered their lives and identities. But even in this pain, there was the recognition that, for a brief moment in time, they had been treated with the same kindness that America so often preached about in its ideals of democracy and freedom. This kindness, in the context of wartime captivity, was an anomaly, and yet it was a powerful one. It was a force that stood in stark contrast to the violence and destruction that had marked the war, offering a glimpse of what could have been, a world where human dignity was not bound by ideology, where enemies could, for a fleeting moment, be treated as equals. As the war came to an end and the world began to rebuild, the story of the German women in Texas and their encounters with the American military would fade into the background of history. But for those who experienced it, it was a powerful, lasting lesson. In the chaos and destruction of World War II, a small group of soldiers had shown that compassion could still be found, even in the most unlikely of places. It was a lesson that would endure, even as the world moved on from the scars of war. In the vast expanse of the Texas plains, the seemingly inconsequential act of offering a horse instead of chains became a powerful symbol of a larger truth, one that reverberated through the lives of those who experienced it and through the larger narrative of war. For the German women who had been conditioned by years of war, tyranny, and fear, the reins in their hands represented a fleeting but profound restoration of their dignity. It was a subtle reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find a way to rise above hatred and violence. The horses, symbols of freedom to one side and tools of oppression to another, became metaphors for the stark divide between the ideologies that had torn the world apart. They symbolized what America stood for, a vast expanse of land where the individual could roam free, not bound by the rigid structures that had governed Europe. To the women who had long been under the thumb of Nazi rule, this moment of autonomy, however brief, was a departure from the chains of oppression they had known. And in that brief moment, the trauma of war seemed to lessen, even if just for a time. The American soldiers, though acting out of a sense of personal responsibility and a belief in democratic ideals, were also participating in something more. They were subtly reaffirming the difference between the ideals they were fighting for and the realities they had just left behind. By offering freedom in the form of horses instead of captivity, they became living symbols of the very ideals they had gone to war to defend. They demonstrated that the victory over tyranny was not just a military conquest, but also a moral one. For the women who experienced this act of kindness, it was more than an isolated incident in their captivity. It was a moment of unexpected clarity, a realization that there was another world beyond the brutality of war, a world defined not by domination, but by respect for individual freedom and human dignity. Even within the confines of captivity, there existed a space where these values could be expressed. In the broader context of World War II, this moment was small, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of death and destruction that defined the conflict. Yet it encapsulated something much larger about the human condition. It was a reminder that, in the end, even the most brutal wars are fought not only for land or power, but for something more fundamental, the preservation of humanity itself. In the offering of a horse instead of chains, the American soldiers demonstrated that even in war, humanity could be honored, that even prisoners could be treated with respect. The horses, then, were not just animals. They were a symbol of the best ideals that America had to offer. The act of placing the reins in the hands of these German women became a subtle but significant gesture in a world that had been engulfed in conflict, brutality, and loss. It was a reminder that the capacity for compassion and respect could, in some way, transcend the horrors of war. For the women, the memory of this act stayed with them long after the war ended. In their fractured world, as they returned to a Germany that had been devastated by the war's consequences, they carried with them the knowledge that not all enemies were the same. The kindness they had been shown in Texas was a testament to the possibility of reconciliation, even after the most terrible of conflicts. It was an acknowledgement that even in the midst of war, the individual was still capable of recognizing the humanity in others, and that this recognition could be as powerful as any military victory. The larger truth that emerges from this quiet moment in Texas is a reminder of the role that compassion plays even in the most difficult circumstances. It is not enough to simply defeat an enemy on the battlefield. True victory comes when, even in the most dire of situations, one can hold on to ideals of decency, kindness, and respect. In the end, the American soldier's decision to offer the reins instead of chains became a small but profound act of defiance against the ideology of the Nazis, a defiance that was as much about the future as it was about the war itself. In the long run, the offering of reins instead of chains was more than just a historical anomaly. It was a symbol of freedom, of dignity, and of the moral high ground that the Allies, particularly America, were fighting to preserve. The women, once enemies in the eyes of the world, were, for a brief moment, seen not as pawns in a brutal war, but as individuals worthy of humanity. And this, in the end, is the greatest triumph of all.